Hi, Lucy. It's me. All right, so I'm going to continue reading The Ranger's Apprentice. This is book 4, The Battle for Skandia. I already made a video where I read chapter 1, so this is chapter 2. The two riders emerged from the trees and into a clear meadow. Down here in the foothills of Tootland, the coming spring was more apparent than in the high mountains that reared ahead of them. The meadow grasses were already showing green, and there were only isolated patches of snow, in spots that usually remain shaded for the greater part of the day. A casual onlooker might have been interested to notice the horses that followed behind the two mounted men. They might even have mistaken the men at a distance for traders who were hoping to take advantage of the first opportunity to cross through the mountain passes into Skandia, and so benefit from the high prices that the season's first trade goods would enjoy. But a closer inspection would have shown that these two men were not traders, they were armed warriors. The smaller of the two, a bearded man clad in a strange gray and green dappled cloak that seemed to shift and waver as he moved, had a longbow slung over his shoulders and a quiver of arrows at his saddle bow. His companion was a larger, younger man. He wore a simple brown cloak, but the early spring sunshine glinted off the chainmail armor at his neck and arms, and the scabbard of a long sword showed underneath the hem of his cloak. Completing the picture, a round buckler was slung over his back, emblazoned with a slightly crude effigy of an oak leaf. Their horses were as mismatched as the men themselves. The younger man sat astride a tall bay, long-legged, with powerful haunches and shoulders. It was the epitome of a battle horse. A second battle horse, this one a black, trotted behind him on a lead rope. His companion's mount was considerably smaller, a shaggy barrel-chested horse, more a pony, really. But it was sturdy and had the look of endurance to it. Another horse similar to the first trotted behind it, lightly laden with the bare essentials for camping and traveling. There was no lead rein on this horse. It followed obediently and willingly. Horace craned his neck up at the tallest of the mountains towering over them. His eyes squinted slightly in the glare of the snow that still lay thickly on the mountain's upper half and now reflected the light of the sun. "You mean to tell me we're going over that?" he asked, his eyes widening. Halt looked sidelong at him with the bare suggestion of a smile. Horace, however, intent on studying the massive mountain formations facing them, failed to see it. "Not over," said the ranger. "Through." Horace frowned thoughtfully at that. "Is there a tunnel of some kind?" "A pass," Halt told him. "A narrow defile that twists and winds through the lower reaches of the mountains and brings us into Skandia itself." Horace digested that piece of information for a moment or two. Then Halt saw his shoulders rise to an intake of breath and knew that the movement presaged another question. He closed his eyes, remembering a time that seemed years ago when he was alone and when life was not an endless series of questions. Then he admitted to himself, strangely, he preferred that things the way they were now. However, he must have made some unintentional noise as he awaited the question, for he noticed that Horace had sealed his lips firmly and determinedly. Obviously, Horace had sensed the reaction and had decided that he would not bother Halt with another question. Not yet, anyways. Which left Halt in a strange quandary, because now that the question wasn't asked, he couldn't help wondering what it would have been. All of a sudden, there was a nagging sense of incompletion about the morning. He tried to ignore the feeling, but it would not be pushed aside. And for once, Horace seemed to have conquered his almost irresistible need to ask the question that had occurred to him. Halt waited a moment or two, but there was no sound except for the jingling of harness and the creaking of leather from their saddles. Finally, the former ranger could bear it no more. "What?" The question seemed to explode out of him with a greater degree of violence than he had intended. Taken by surprise, Horace's bay shied in fright and danced several paces away. Horace turned an aggrieved look on his mentor as he calmed the horse and brought it back under control. "What?" he asked Halt, and the smaller man made a gesture of exasperation. "That's what I want to know," he said irritably. "What?" Horace peered at him. The look was all too obviously the sort of look that you give to someone who seems to have taken leave of his senses. It did little to improve Halt's rapidly rising temper. "What?" said Horace, now totally puzzled. "Don't keep parroting at me," Halt fumed. "Stop repeating what I say. I asked you what, so don't ask me what back. Understand? Horace considered the question for a second or two, then in his deliberate way he replied, No. Hall took a deep breath. His eyebrows contracted into a deep V, and beneath them his eyes sparkled with anger. But before he could speak, Horace forestalled him. What are you asking me? Then, thinking how to make his question clear, he added, Or, to put it in another way, why are you asking what? Controlling himself with enormous restraint and making no secret of the fact, Halt said very precisely, You were about to ask a question. Horace frowned. I was? Halt nodded. You were. I saw you take a breath to ask it. I see, said Horace. And what was it about? For just a second or two, Halt was speechless. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then finally found the strength to speak. That is what I was asking you, he said. When I said what, I was asking you what you were about to ask me. I wasn't about to ask you what, Horace replied, and Halt glared at him suspiciously. It occurred to him that Horace could be indulging himself in a gigantic lake pool, that he was secretly laughing at Halt. This, Halt could have told him, was not a good career move. Rangers were not people who took kindly to being laughed at. He studied the boy's open face and guileless blue eyes and decided that his suspicion was ill-founded. Then what, if I may use that word once more, were you about to ask me? Horace drew breath once more, then hesitated. I forget, he said. What were we talking about? Never mind, Halt muttered, and he nudged Abelard into a canter for a few strides to draw ahead of his companion. Sometimes the ranger could be confusing, and Horace thought it best to forget the whole conversation. Yet, as happened so often, the moment he stopped trying to consciously remember the thought that had prompted his question, it popped back into his mind again. Are there many passes? He asked Halt. The ranger twisted in his saddle to look back at him. What? He asked. Horace wisely chose to ignore the fact that they were heading for dangerous territory with that word once more. He gestured to the mountains, frowning down upon them. Through the mountains. Are there many passes into Skandia through the mountains? Halt checked Abelard's stride momentarily, allowing the bay to catch up with them, then resumed his pace. 3 or 4, he said. Then don't the Skandians guard them? Horace asked. It seemed logical to him that they would. Of course they do, Halt replied. The mountains form their principal line of defense. So how did you plan for us to get past them? The ranger hesitated. It was a question that had been taxing his mind since they had taken the road from Chateau Monsomme. If he were by himself, he would have no trouble slipping past unseen. With Horace in company and riding a big, spirited battle horse, it might be a more difficult matter. He had a few ideas, but had yet to settle on any one of them. I'll think of something, he temporized, and Horace nodded wisely, satisfied that Halt would indeed think of something. In Horace's world, that was what rangers did best, and the best thing a warrior apprentice could do was let the ranger get on with thinking while a warrior took care of walloping anybody who needed to be walloped along the way. He settled back into his saddle, contented with his lot. Chapter 3. Eric Starfollower, wolfship captain and one of the senior war jarls of the Skandians, made his way through the low-ceilinged, wood-paneled lodge to the great hall. His face was marked with a frown as he went. He had plenty to do with the spring raiding season coming on. His ship needed repairs and refitting. Most of all, it needed the fine-tuning that only a few days at sea could bring. Now this summons from Ragnak boded ill for his plans, particularly since the summons had come through the medium of Borsa, the Oberjarl's Hilfman or administrator. If Borsa were involved, it usually meant that Ragnak had some little task for Eric to look after. Or some not-so-little task, the wolfship skipper thought wryly. Breakfast has long since finished, so there was only a few servants cleaning up the hall when he arrived. At the far end, seated at the rough pine table off to one side of Ragnak's high seat, a massive pinewood chair that served in place of a throne for the Skandian ruler, sat Ragnak and Borsa, their heads bowed over a pile of parchment scrolls. Eric recognized these scrolls. They were the tax returns for the various towns and shires throughout Skandia. Ragnak was obsessed with them. As for Borsa, his life was totally dominated by them. He breathed, slept, and dreamed the tax returns, and woe betide any local jarl who might try to shortchange Ragnak, or claim any deduction that wouldn't pass Borsa's fine-tooth comb inspection. Eric put 2 and 2 together and sighed quietly. The most likely conclusion that he could draw from the two facts of his summoning and the pile of tax returns on this table was that he was about to be sent off on another tax collecting mission. Tax collecting was not something that Eric enjoyed. He was a raider and a sea wolf, a pirate and a fighter. As such, his inclination was to be more on the side of the tax evaders than the overjarl and his eager-fingered Helfman. Unfortunately, on those previous occasions when Eric had been sent out to collect overdue unpaid taxes, he had been too successful for his own good. Now, whenever there was the slightest doubt about the amount of tax owing from a village or a shire, Borsa automatically thought of Eric as the solution to the problem. To make matters worse, Eric's attitude and approach to the job only added to his desirability in Borsa and Ragnak's eyes. Bored with the task and considering it embarrassing and belittling, he made sure he spent as little time on the job as possible. The torturous arguments and recalculations of amounts owed after all deductions had been proved and agreed were not for him. Eric opted for a more direct course, which consisted of seizing the person under investigation, ramming a double-headed broadaxe tip under his chin, and threatening mayhem if all taxes, every single one of them, were not paid immediately. Eric's reputation as a fighter was well known throughout Skandia. To his annoyance, he was never asked to make good on his threat. Those recalcitrants whom he visited invariably coughed up the due amount, and often a little extra had never been in contention, without the slightest argument or hesitation. The two men at the table looked up as he made his way through the benches towards the end of the room. The great hall served more than one purpose. It was where Ragnak and his close followers took their meals. It was also the site of all banquets and official gatherings in Skandia's rough and ready social calendar. And the small open annex where Ragnak and Borsa were currently studying tax returns was also Ragnak's office. It wasn't particularly private, since any member of the inner or outer council of Jarls had access to the hall at any time of day. But then, Ragnak wasn't the sort to need privacy. He ruled openly and made all his policy statements to the world at large. "Ah, Eric, you're here," said Borsa. And Eric thought, not for the first time, that Hulfman had a habit of stating the bleeding obvious. "Who is it this time?" he said in a resigned tone. He knew there was no use trying to argue his way out of the assignment, so he may as well just get on with it. With luck, it would be one of the small towns down the coast, and at least he might have a chance to work up his crew and wolf ship at the same time. "Oakskrag," the Oberjarl told him, and Eric's hope of salvaging something useful from this assignment faded to nothing. Ostrag lay far inland to the east. It was a small settlement on the far side of the mountain range that formed the rugged spine of Skandia, and was accessible only by going over the mountains themselves, or through one of the half-dozen tortuous passes that wound their way through. At best, it meant an uncomfortable journey there and back by pony, a method of transport that Eric loathed. As he thought of the mountain range that reared over Hallesholm, he had a quick memory of the two Aruluan slaves he'd helped to escape several months ago. He wondered what had become of them, whether they made it to the small hunting cabin high in the mountains, and whether they had survived the last months of winter. He realized abruptly that Borsa and Ragnak were both waiting for his reaction. "Oskrag," he repeated. Ragnak nodded impatiently. "Their quarterly payments is overdue. I want you to go and shake them up," said the Oberjarl. Eric noticed that Ragnak couldn't quite hide the avaricious gleam that came into his eyes whenever he talked about tax and payments. Eric couldn't help giving vent to an exasperated sigh. "They can't be overdue by more than a week or so," he temporized. But Ragnak was not to be swayed and shook his head violently. 10 days, he snapped. "And it's not the first time. I've won them before, haven't I, Borsa?" And he turned to the Helfman, who nodded. "That Jarl at Ostrag is Sten Hammerhand," Borsa said, as if that were explanation enough. Eric stared blankly at him. "He should be called Sten Gluehand," he elaborated with heavy sarcasm. "The tax payments have stuck to his fingers before this, and even when they're paid in full, he always makes us wait long past the overdue time. It's time we taught him a lesson." Eric smiled with some irony at the small, sparsely muscled Helfman. Borsa could be an extremely threatening figure, he thought, when someone else was available to carry out his threats. "You mean it's time I taught him a lesson," he suggested. But Borsa didn't exactly notice the sarcasm in his voice. "Exactly," he said with some satisfaction. Ragnak, however, was a little more perceptive. "It's my money after all, Eric," he said. Then there was an almost petulant note in his voice. Eric met his gaze steadily. For the first time, he realized that Ragnak was getting older. The once flaming red hair was duller, and it was turning gray. It came as a surprise to Eric. He certainly didn't feel that he was growing older, yet Ragnak didn't have too many years on him. He could notice other changes in the Oberjal now that he'd become aware of the fact. His jowls were heavier, and his waistline thickening. He wondered if he was changing too. It's been a severe winter, he suggested. Perhaps the passes are still blocked. There's a lot of late snow. He moved to the large-scale map of Skandia that was displayed on the wall behind Ragnak's table. He found Ostkrag, and with one forefinger traced the way to the closest pass. The Serpent Pass, he said almost to himself. It's not impossible that all the late-season snow and the sudden thaw have led to landslides in there. He turned back to Ragnak and Borsa, indicating the position on the map then. Maybe the couriers simply can't get through yet, he suggested. Ragnak shook his head, and again Eric sensed the irritability, the irrational annoyance that seemed to grip Ragnak these days, whenever his will was thwarted or his judgment questioned. It's Sten, I knew it, he said stubbornly. If it were anybody else, I might agree with you, Eric. Eric nodded, knowing full well that the words were a lie. Ragnak rarely agreed with anyone if it meant changing his own position. Get up there and get the money from him. If he argues, arrest him and bring him back. In fact, arrest him even if he doesn't argue. Take 20 men with you. I want him to see a real show of strength. I'm sick of being taken for a fool by these petty jarls. Eric looked up in some surprise. Arresting a jarl in his own lodge was not something to be lightly contemplated, particularly for such a petty offense as a late tax payment. Among the Skandians, tax evasion was considered to be almost obligatory. It was a form of sport. If you were caught, you paid up and that was the end of it. Eric could not remember anyone being submitted to the shame of arrest on that account. That might not be wise, he said quietly, and Ragnak glared up at him, his eyes searching for Eric's over the scattered accounts on the table before him. I'll decide what's wise, he grated. I'm Oberjarl, not you. The words were offensive. Eric was a senior jarl, and by long-established custom, he was entitled to air his opinion, even though it might be contrary to his leaders. He bit back the angry retort that sprang to his lips. There was no point provoking Ragnak any further when he was in this mood. I know you're the Oberjarl, Ragnak, he said quietly, but Sten is a jarl in his own right, and he may well have a perfectly valid reason for this late payment. To arrest him in those circumstances would be unnecessarily provocative. I'm telling you, he won't have what you call a valid reason. Ragnak's eyes were narrowed now, and his face was suffused with his anger. He's a thief and a holdout, and he needs to be made an example to the others. Ragnak, Eric began, trying to reason one last time. This time it was Borsa who interrupted. Yada Ragnak, you have your instructions. Now do as you're ordered, he shouted, and Eric turned angrily to face him. I follow the Oberjarl's orders, Hilfman, not yours. Borsa realized his mistake. He backed away a pace or two, making sure the substantial bulk of the table was between him and Eric. His eyes slid away from the other man's, and there was an ugly silence. Finally, Ragnak seemed to realize that some form of backdown might be necessary, although not too much. He said in an irritated tone, Look, Eric, just go and get those taxes back from Sten. And if he's been holding out on purpose, bring him back here for trial, all right? And if he has a valid reason, Eric insisted. The Oberjarl waved a hand in surrender. If he has a valid reason, you can leave him alone. Does that suit you? Eric nodded. Under those conditions, all right. He agreed. He had the loophole he'd been looking for. As far as he was concerned, the fact that Ragnak was an insufferable pain in the buttocks was a more than valid reason for not paying taxes on time. Mind you, he might have to find another way of phrasing it when he returned without arresting Sten. Chapter 4. Will came awake with a jerk. He had been sitting on the edge of the porch in the sun and realized he must have nodded off. Ruefully, hey, lay down. Sit up. Lay down. Just lay down. No. Lay down. Lay down. She's pacing, and so she keeps jingling. Lay down. We're not going anywhere. Chapter 4. Will came away with a jerk. He had been sitting on the edge of the porch in the sun, and he realized that he must have nodded off. Ruefully, he thought about how much of his time he spent sleeping these days. Evelyn said it was only to be expected as he was regaining his strength. He supposed she was right, but that didn't mean he had to like it. There was also the fact that there was so little to do around the hut where they had spent their time since escaping from the Skandian stronghold. Today he had cleared away and washed their breakfast dishes, then made the beds and straightened the few pieces of furniture in the cabin. That had taken barely half an hour, so he had groomed the pony in the lean-to behind the cabin until its coat shone. The pony looked at him and at itself with mild surprise. He guessed nobody had ever spent so much care on its appearance in the past. After that, Will had wandered aimlessly around the cabin and the small clearing, inspecting those patches where the damp brown grass was beginning to show through the snow cover. He had idly considered making some more snares, then discarded the idea. They had more than they needed already. Feeling bored and useless, he had sat down on the porch to wait for Evelyn's return. At some stage, he must have nodded off, affected by the warmth of the sun. That warmth was long gone now, he realized. The sun had traveled fully across the clearing, and the pines were throwing long shadows across the cabin. It must be mid-afternoon, he estimated. A frown creased his forehead. Evelyn had left well before noon to check the snares, even allowing for the fact that they had moved the trap line further and further away from the cabin. She should have had time to reach the line, check the snares, and return by now. She must have been gone for at least 3 hours, possibly more. Unless she had already returned and, seeing him sleeping, had decided not to wake him. He stood now, his stiff joints protesting, and checked inside the cabin. There was no sign that she had returned. The game bag and her thick woolen cloak were still missing. Will's frown deepened, and he began to pace the small clearing, wondering what he should do. He wished he knew exactly how long she had been gone and silently berated himself for falling asleep. Deep down in the pit of his stomach, a vague uneasiness stirred as he wondered what could have become of his companion. He reviewed the possibilities. She could have lost her way and be wandering through the thickly growing, snow-covered pines, trying to find her way back to the cabin. Possible, but unlikely. She had blazed the paths leading to their trap line with discreet marks, and he had blazed the paths leading to their trap line with discreet marks, and Evelyn knew where to look for them. Perhaps she had been injured. She could have fallen or twisted an ankle. The paths were rough and steep in places, and that was a definite possibility. She might be lying now, injured and unable to walk, stranded in the snow with the afternoon drawing on toward night. The third possibility was the worst. She had encountered someone. Anyone she ran into in this mountain was likely to be an enemy. Perhaps she had been recaptured by the Skandians. His pulse raced for a moment as he considered the thought. He knew they would show little mercy to an escaped slave, and while Eric had helped them before, he would unlikely be able to do so again, even if he had the opportunity. As he had been considering these possibilities, he had begun to moving around the cabin, collecting his things in preparation for setting out to look for her. He had filled one of their water skins from the bucket of creek water that he had brought to the cabin each day, and crammed a few pieces of cold meat into a carry sack. He laced on his thick walking boots, winding the thongs rapidly around his legs, almost up to the knee, and unhooked his sheepskin vest from the peg behind the door. On the whole, he thought the second possibility was the most likely. Chances were that Evelyn was injured somewhere, unable to walk. The chance she might have been retaken by the Skandians was very slim indeed, he realized. It was still too early in the season for people to be moving around the mountain. The only reason for doing so would be to hunt game, and it was still too scarce to be worth the trouble of fighting through the thick drifts of snow that blocked the way in so many parts of the mountain. No, on the whole, it was most likely that Evelyn was safe, just incapacitated, which meant his next logical move would be to put a bridle and saddle on the pony and lead him along as he tracked her so that he could ride back to the cabin once he found her. So that she could ride back to the cabin once he found her. He had no doubt that he would find her. He was already a skilled tracker, although nowhere near the standard of Halter Gillen. And tracking the girl through snow-covered territory would be a relatively simple matter. And yet, he was reluctant to take the pony with him. The little horse would make unnecessary noise, and a nagging doubt told Will he should proceed with caution. It was unlikely that Evelyn had encountered strangers, but it wasn't impossible. It might be wiser to travel unobtrusively until he found out the real state of affairs. As he came to this decision, he stripped the beds of their blankets, tying them into a roll they slung over his shoulder. It might prove necessary to spend the night in the open, and it would be better to be prepared. He picked up a flint and steel from the nearby fireplace and dropped it into one of his pockets. Finally, he was ready to go. He stood at the door, taking one last look around the cabin to see if there was anything else he might need. The small hunting bow and a quiver of arrows leaned by the door jamb. On an impulse, he picked them up, slinging the quiver across his back with the roll of blankets. Then another thought struck him, and he crossed back to the fireplace, selecting a half-burned stick from the ashes. On the outside of the door, he printed in crude letters, "Looking for you. Wait here." After all, it was possible that Evelyn might turn up after he had left, and he wanted to make sure she didn't go blundering off, trying to find him while he was trying to find her. He took a few seconds to string the bow. Halt's voice echoed in his ears. An unstrung bow is just something extra to carry. A strung bow is a weapon. He looked at it disdainfully. It wasn't much of a weapon, he thought, but that and the small knife in his belt were all that he had. He moved to the edge of the clearing, picking up the clear trail of Evelyn's footprints in the snow. They were blurred after a morning of spring sunshine, but they still showed up, maintaining a steady trot. Maintaining a steady trot, he moved off into the forest. Will followed her trail easily as it wound up into the higher reaches of the mountain. Before too long, his pace had dropped from the steady jog, and he was walking, breathing hard as he went. He realized that he was in poor condition. There had been a time when he could have maintained that ground-eating lope for hours. Now, after barely 20 minutes, he was puffing and exhausted. He shook his head in disgust and continued to follow the footprints. Of course, following the trail was made easier by the fact that he had already had a good idea of the direction Evelyn had been heading. He had helped her relocate the snares a few days earlier. At that time, he recalled, they had gone at an easier pace, resting frequently so as not to tire him out. Evelyn had been reluctant to allow him to walk so far, but had given in to the inevitable. She had no real idea how to place the snares where they might have the best chance of trapping small game. That was one of Will's areas of expertise. He knew how to look for and recognize the small signs that showed where the rabbits and birds moved, where they were most likely to poke their unsuspecting heads into the looped snares. It had taken Evelyn about 40 minutes to reach the trapline that morning. Will covered the distance in an hour and a quarter, stopping more frequently as the time went on to rest and recover his breath. He resented the stops, knowing they were costing him daylight, but there was no point pushing himself until he was utterly exhausted. He had to keep himself in condition to give Evelyn any assistance she might need when he found her. The sun had dropped over the crest of the mountain by the time he reached the blazed tree that marked the beginning of the trapline. He touched one hand to the cut bark, then turned to head off the track into the pines, when he saw something out of the corner of his eye, something that froze his heart in mid-beat. There was the clear imprint of a horse's hooves in the snow, and they overlay the tracks that Evelyn had left. Someone had followed her. Forgetting his weariness, Will ran, half crouching, through the thick pine to the spot where the first snare had been laid. The snow there was disturbed and cut and scuffed. He fell to his knees, trying to read the story that was written there. The empty snare first. He could see where Evelyn had reset the noose, smoothing the snow around it and scattering a few grains of seed. There had been an animal in the snare when she'd arrived. Then he cast wider, seeing the other sets of footprints moving into position behind her as she had knelt, engrossed in the task of resetting the snare and probably jubilant in the fact that they had caught something. The horse's tracks had stopped some 20 meters away. Obviously, the animal was trained to move silently, much as ranger horses were. He felt an uneasy sense of misgiving at that. He didn't like the idea of an enemy who had these sorts of skills, and by now he knew he was dealing with an enemy of some kind. The signs of the struggle between Evelyn and the enemy were all too clear to his trained eye. He could almost see the man. He assumed it was a man, moving quietly behind her, grabbing her and dragging her back through the snow. The wild disturbance of the ground showed how Evelyn had kicked and struggled. Then suddenly the struggling had stopped, and two shallow furrows in the snow led back to where the horse waited. Her heels, he realized, as her unconscious body had been dragged away. Unconscious, or dead, he thought, and a chill hand seized his heart at the thought. Then he shook it away determinedly. No sense in carrying her away if he'd killed her, he told himself, and he almost believed it. But he still had a gnawing uncertainty in the pit of his belly as he followed the horse's tracks back to the main trail, and then in the opposite direction of that trail that led back to the cabin. He was glad he'd thought to bring the blankets. It was going to be a cold night, he thought. He was also glad that he thought to bring the bow, although he found himself wishing he still had the powerful recurve bow that he lost at the bridge in Celtica. It was a far superior weapon to the low-powered Skandia hunting bow, and he had the uncomfortable certainty that he was going to need a weapon in the very near future. Okay. I love you.